Chris, could you provide a glossary, that's for the handout, which I didn't have up here myself, with abbreviations used in your handout, CCC, AG, and RN?
Sure. We love our documents in the Catholic Church, if you didn't know. CCC is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's really the compendium of the Church's doctrinal teaching that came out under John Paul II. AG, that's Ad Gentes. That's the missionary document that came out of Vatican II. RN is Redemptoris Missio, and that was the, I can't remember if it was a papal letter of John Paul II on the permanent validity of the Church's mission. And then EG is the one you most often see, and that's this one, Joy of the Gospel, Evangelization. And this is really, if you wanted one document, because this pretty much takes into itself most of what all the previous documents have said. In fact, it's a really large, probably one of the largest I've ever seen, apostolic exhortations. And then I think there might be one called GITM, and that's the Gospel in the World, and that's the name of the document that the Synod that prepared this document for the Pope put out just prior to, that they give the Pope, and then he uses it to kind of formulate his document. If there's any I missed, you can ask me after, and I'll be able to let you know. So.
And most of these are probably available on, say, EWTN's website.
Yeah, well, they would all be, yeah.
Website.
Yeah, every single one of them would be available on EWTN's library website or the Vatican website.
Yeah. There's also the Daughters of St. Paul on Balboa.
Right, that's correct. And if you
down Balboa in Genesee, they have all these books there.
Right, but many of them are online.
Yeah, all of them are online now. So.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church has a secondary document, which is about twice as thick, with all of the references.
Right.
That's in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. If you're reading something and you want to read the original document, just go to this other book. And it's there, it's great. If you do research. The last, I'll give this other one here, and both, I guess, can talk about this. Raul Castro, the president of Cuba, said after he met with Pope Francis that he will pray and go back to church. That what he said that's what he said to the media. What do you think about this subject related to evangelization?
I read that.
I guess that was.
I read that online last week.
And it was in the news too.
Pardon?
It was on the news too.
It was in the news, yeah.
If I could make one comment, I was taken by something that Chris pointed out, where he said that we have to evangelize, we have to be where people are at. I guess as a psychologist, I think this is important. We have to be where people are at, and people are at different, you think of the ladder of divine ascent, you might be familiar with that. Okay, people are at different points on the ladder, okay, so to speak. And so if we prejudge the individual, we can talk about the sin, but we don't know the other two parts, you know, the full intent of the will or the full consent of the will, and so on and so forth, and the intention. So God is much more merciful than we could ever be in terms of understanding where people are at. And so it's very, very important that to accept people the way they are, not to condone what they're doing, but nevertheless to greet them and to accept them with respect. And I don't know how that fits in with, you know, the people in Cuba, because Chris mentioned something about the idea that people who are nominally Catholic or Orthodox, and there are many nominal Orthodox, let me just speak for that, okay, where, you know, even if they go to church on Sunday, it doesn't mean that in their heart they're actually committed to Christ and His church. So these people need evangelization also, understanding preceding evangelization. You know, and I think that's an important thing. Anything, you think there's some opportunities for, you know, our apostolic churches in Cuba? Or?
Yeah, and I think this goes to something that the Pope said about Evangelii Gaudium when he talked about we need to look at the bigger picture, the same reasons why people leave are often contained within them, the reasons why people return. And I think mentioning the clarity and charity part, that I said you can say the same thing or come across in a way that's different. You know, Pope John Paul II went there, and they were willing to open some churches for it, but it wasn't the movement that you saw with Francis, who goes in, and I'm not criticizing John Paul II, but it's just two different approaches, two different men, two different time periods, and the opportunity was now. The way that Francis sort of presents Christianity, even among the media in this country, in some ways it's one of those things that we'll have to deal with eventually, because they don't hear most of what he actually says. They conglomerate on the things they want to hear. But nevertheless, he's at least made people who would generally not be open to Christianity in general, or Catholicism in particular, he has made them kind of look again with his approach. And really, he's become what Pope John Paul II is also called, and that is the Pope of Mercy. Really going out there, or as they called St. Francis, the pardon of God, to just go forth and, again, communicate God's love to people, and never give up on any human being, because I don't think in any of our minds this would have been a person who would have suddenly said, hey, maybe I'll go back to church. We still have to see how the Spirit will take him, but God used Francis as an opportunity, and also that one-on-one, kind of commitment to people.
Yeah, when I read that, it just seemed to me that, wherever he was in his life, he's been really influenced by some of the teaching and preaching that Pope Francis has done. And I mean, it seemed genuine to me that he's going, wow, maybe I missed something there, and there's something there to go back to. I think it's really neat. A lot of Orthodox are saying things about Francis. Seems like he could be a pope who could really bridge some of the differences because of that compassion, and saying the most important thing is to reach out to people and show love. One of my favorite saints is not too well known in the West, St. Isaac of Syria. And he has a series of treatises and homilies and so on. You could look at it on Amazon and find it. But he's known as the Saint of Mercy. And one of the things that was most outstanding about him is that he made a statement that God is even in hell, waiting there for the demons to turn to him. Now, how merciful can we get beyond that? So, now, I think any priest would be able to hopefully answer this question, but nevertheless, we'll have our speakers answer it, and then the clergy can comment on this. How do we respond when someone says, if you were all about the love of God, you would let me marry my same-sex partner, let me cohabit with my boyfriend or girlfriend, let me have an abortion when I want. If you don't let me do what I want, I won't believe that you love me, and I won't listen to you.
Let the priest answer.
Well, you teach deacons, I found out, and Patty, you must come across this one-to-one work, possibly. So I've come across this dozens of times. So. Go ahead. Yes.
I mean, you could add to that. If I want to jump off a tall building, if you'd love me, you'd let me. If I wanted to stab myself right now through the heart, if you loved me, you'd let me. It's a whole theology of permissiveness, that doing whatever you want makes you happy. And actually, the opposite of that would be tough love. Not to let them do that, but to manage to stop them at the moment from doing anything like that until you could have a chance to communicate with them the destructiveness of what they were doing.
One moment, Father, if I could just give an example, okay? All know that I'm a clinical psychologist as well as a priest, okay? Now, back in New Jersey, if you look into my photo, the same thing here. If you went to my office, there are icons everywhere. I dress in clerical dress. And I was known as the gay-friendly priest. Because if a patient would come to me and they were gay, I would say, all right, you're gay. Now what? But you don't approve of me. I said, I'm not saying that I said, you are the person that you are. I accept that. Okay? Now, what problem would you like to work on? Now, if they said that they wanted to deal with being gay, then I would work with them on that. If they had said, what is God's plan for us, for me, I would talk to them about that. But I would never put the person down personally. Although, in other words, that expression, which is not in the Gospels, hate the sin but love the sinner, okay? The person always felt accepted and loved. That was always been my approach. Although they knew exactly where the line was in terms of the action itself. And I would always point out, for example, that all of us are called to a certain standard, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, or whatever, okay? So we're all called to a standard. And if we want to be in God's favor, then we can respond to that. If we choose not to, then that's our choice. But meanwhile, I will still be there in hell waiting for you to turn around, if you want to. Father?
My comment would be, what is your understanding of love? When somebody says, if you love me, you'd let me do whatever I want, well, if it goes to what Father James also said, but if I love, well, my true love is to wish the greatest good for the person. And to say I love you by letting you do something very destructive is not love, it's actually hatred. So, or misguided love. So that's how I would partially respond to that. Is, tell me what you mean love is.
Well, yeah, love is always for the good and welfare of the individual, but at some point you have to say, you have to ask the question whether, at what point do we permit or what point do we prohibit? For example, we have freedom of speech, but we are prohibited from yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? So even though we have freedom of speech. So, you know, politically, for example, right now, at least, I guess it's going to go before the Supreme Court, it is, with any good argument. You have abortion, that people have the right to choose, and do states, you know, state law contravene other states and so on and so forth. So that is actually giving permission for someone to kill another individual. Now, out of love, do we say that is not permissible? I would say that. But on the other hand, you know, two people cohabiting together, out of love, even though it's not God's plan, can I prohibit them from cohabiting together? So at what point do you say, well, that would not be what God says we should be doing. We should be in a committed relationship before it be a sexual relationship. Or do I, or do I pass a law like it used to be, how many years ago now, a century or so ago, prohibiting cohabitation type of thing? Wasn't that, weren't there laws like that? Right, and so on. So now, we don't have laws anymore prohibiting it, but we would say that in terms of God's understanding of what, you know, being one in Christ and, you know, one flesh in marriage, there has to be that commitment with one another toward creativity and so on and so on. So we teach what Christ has taught us about it, and we legally allow it, permit it. At what point do we prohibit it? And that's partly, unfortunately, a political question. No?
Well, I think we find ourselves back, and maybe this is why evangelization has taken the road it has. I think we find ourselves in many ways back to the original church, that, like Pope Francis says, we cannot count on even a Christian so-called culture like America really understanding or following the message anymore. That we need to recognize, like the early Christians, we really are little cells in a vastly pagan world, really. And so we do our part, we preach the message, and in our country we have the ability to, as groups, vote on things, and so as Catholics we should, and Orthodox, we should vote as our conscience, which should follow that of what our church teaches, go forward. We always have to recognize we're going to be we're gonna be coming up against forces of people coming from a place that aren't coming from that background, or just a lot of woundedness and things, and so we just have to recognize the complexity. We don't lower the law for anybody, but we have to recognize, and like you said, meet people where they are, and continue to work with them, even if the homosexual isn't struggling against his homosexuality or wants to, or, I do spiritual direction as well. For the deacons' wives also are required to have a spiritual director as they go through their training, and I don't know why, but the diocese has assigned 2 of them. And, you hear these people's lives who on the face of everything looks wonderful, but then you get into real issues of life, and yeah, the same thing, you don't break relationships, you hear some very serious things sometimes, but it's just part of the reality of ministry, is we live in a world that's fallen and broken, and so we remain, like Francis said, those lights in the darkness and everything, but we need to recognize people are going to be coming from all over the place.
While the talks were going on, I just jotted down a few things I remembered. I just read the recent Pew Research report. In the United States in 2007, 86% of adults identified themselves as Christians. Today, only 76%. 23% of Americans consider themselves unaffiliated. Of those 23%, 34% are agnostic or atheist. And so this is the culture that we're facing today in this country. And the Catholic Church has lost numbers. The mainline Protestant churches have really lost numbers. And for every one person who joins the Catholic Church in this country, 6 leave. So this is the younger generations. So it's an interesting dynamic that we have to face.
I think what Chris in his talk pointed out here, that I think you said Pope Francis pointed out, or whatever, I'd have to go back and read it, that for those who are leaving and struggling, that also gives us an entryway into how to evangelize them once we isolate what are the factors that have led to that, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Right.
And that's why, for example, when I have worked with people who are gay, I don't give up on that. And I can give examples where people will say, you've never given up on me. And at some point, they I don't know, I say, the light of Christ illumines all. At some point they begin to see that because I'm not putting them down personally, even though they know that I will not accept their lifestyle, they still feel that they are loved in a sense, and that they could make that movement if they wanted to unite themselves to Christ and His Church. So, but it's very, very difficult. All right, I want to thank our speakers and for the people who gave the questions. Yes, one more question.
It's just something that kind of sums it up, our attitude toward evangelization. And believe it or not, it's a quote from an atheist. It was Penn Jillette. And it goes, how much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? I mean, I believe beyond the shadow of a doubt that a truck was coming at you, and you didn't believe that the truck was bearing down on you. There's a certain point where I tackled it, and this is more important than that.
Thank you. All right, we're going to start our business meeting. Our business meeting. We have another question. How do we evangelize when we ourselves are on a low place on the ladder of spirituality? I thought one of you answered that question already, in a sense.
Well, I think we both talked about it.
Yeah.
That you have to grow in your own faith before you can share with others.
But just doing anything in Christ's name, no matter how low it is that you are, right?
Yeah. And it's always dangerous.
But if you look at the Samaritan woman, that's almost an example of that. And that, married 5 times, living with a man, and yet she went out and became the first apostle, so to speak, if you want, and went back to her village, the marketplace, the Boros, right, and so on, and brought everyone back to Christ. And she was pretty low, no?
So even if you're, right.
We need to recognize we'll never be perfect. You can't hold yourself off so long until you reach a standard that you think is the appropriate one for God to use, because God will use you if you're open. Certainly you have to be a person of prayer, so you have to pray more and more. You have to be a person who lives in the community of faith. You know, you have to be a sacramental life and things like this. But I would also just caution in general, one of the obstacles to the spiritual life is worrying where you are in the spiritual life. I mean, we have it all laid out for us very nicely through the saints and the fathers of the church. At the same time, you know, we have purgation to illumination to union and all the various ways that's described. But in another reality, all three are always kind of going on inside of us to some extent as we're also progressing generally. But, you know, the more, in a sense, the more humble you are, the more God can use you anyway. So just try to draw close to Him, like Patty said, and then reach out, you know, pray for those opportunities. You'll see them for little small things. Maybe someone you've been talking to will suddenly broach an issue of spirituality, which really wasn't between you guys, or just continue to pray for people. It's those very little things that over time, you know, will begin to break down the walls. This whole thing with Castro and the Pope, I guarantee it wasn't just his visit. People have probably been praying for him for a long time, and conversion, and you know, the family's divided because of the whole Cuban situation for a long time. So a lot of little stuff led up to finally now a big moment where someone goes in, because we also have to recognize that we're all just helping people at one rung along the path. Some of us get the glory of seeing the whole journey from beginning to end. Others of us get the niceness of being at the end, you know, where they finally get the faith. But some of us may be at one of the lower rungs where we'll never see even the next step, and we've done our part, and we might never ever see them again. And so we just need to recognize that we have our part to play, but not get overly concerned about, am I worthy of doing this or not? Because the answer to that is yes and no. We're absolutely worthy because we're the image of God. On the other hand, we're not worthy because we're sinners. So we live in this mixture until perfection.
Thank you. All right, everyone, we'll start the business meeting now.